you, Frank Daniel, who is all the way from USA with us, and he works in the regulatory compliance with Bush Brothers and Company. And he's going to talk about leveraging food science and nutrition in regulatory affairs in food industry. So Daniel, again, our own student who has done BSc as well as MSc in Foods and Nutrition in the Department of Foods and Nutrition, the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. And thereafter, he qualified for PhD in CFTRI, in the University of Mysore. And he did work for a while in food processing university in Coimbatore as a lecturer, and in Coca-Cola India in Gurgaon before he moved on to USA. And he'll be talking about his journey from how he moved on from the Department of Foods and Nutrition to now as a scientific and regulatory affairs technical governance officer in the current company as regulatory compliance in Bush Brothers. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Vanisha, for those kind words. Let me share my screen first. I'd like to take this time to also thank the Alumni Association and the department for inviting me here to talk to all of you about my experiences. It's been a really interesting journey from the department to where I am today. And I think Rachna said that perfectly when she says a lot of what I am today is because of the training that I got and the education and everything that I learned at the department. So thank you.
Frank, can I request you to please keep your video on?
It is on.
Yes, on the right side. I should see it on the screen. Your video.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. And so I've spent about 12 years in regulatory affairs, the first 10 of them in Coca-Cola, 6 years in India, 4 years here in Atlanta, and the last 2 years in Bush Brothers, doing about the same kind of role that I've done for over 10 years at Coke. But what I say about my own job is no 2 days are alike. And that's one of the reasons why I've stayed on in this role and in this job. If you heard both Purnima and Rachna talk about the people in the industry or within their own companies that actually evaluate the claims and help translate that back to marketing and see what we can actually say, that's me. Rachna called me a policeman, and for all practical purposes, I am, although we still keep trying to be partners and not policemen. So here's an outline of how I'd like to go through today's talk. Give you a very brief introduction to food regulations. Want to talk about what regulatory affairs in a food industry does. Talk about my role, what is in a snapshot that I do. I also want to share a mind map of everything that I do currently in the role at Bush Brothers. And then I think for all the students who are listening into this webinar, if you've ever wondered, why am I studying this? I want to make some connections between the courses that you have and some of the tasks that I've done in my career and how the training or education during those courses helped the most. So I hope I can take you through that journey. In terms of food regulations, it's interesting that Chanakya actually mentioned food adulteration way back in 375 BC. And ideally, food adulteration has been the backbone for all food regulations across the world. And even in the US, the 1906 publication of The Jungle basically was like the precursor to our Pure Foods and Drugs Act here in the US, and was mainly for the meatpacking industry. In India, when I started my career in 2008 in Coke, I was looking at regulations from 1954 and 55. And I think I've been very fortunate to work with FSSAI that was set up after the 2006 Food Safety and Standards Act, and actually work with the officers there as part of food industry, sitting across the table, not as the regulator and the regulatee, but partners basically to work out regulations and come up with those. And it's been a, a kind of very satisfying journey to see how that's evolved today and how FSSAI is now considered one of the premier food regulatory standard authorities or agencies across the world, and the great job that they're doing. It wasn't up till the 70s that regulatory affairs, started coming up as a health-related profession, kind of looking at food safety from that angle. And it was only in the late 80s that it was recognized as a profession by itself. Roles came up in different companies. Industries started setting up specific jobs for people in this area. And today, if you see, most industries have a regulatory affairs professional, and it's moved on from just being health related. You see a lot of regulatory compliance these days in banking, financial, IT services, but there still are a very critical part of the industries, drugs, biologics, devices, and of course, food and beverage. So for me, compliance has always been external and internal. I always tell people, don't forget that there are internal compliances also. It's not just the outside regulations. So there are different laws that you need to comply with. There are specific regulations to the food that you may be putting out. And then you have company requirements, and then requirements on the consumers or the customer side. For more transparency that you need to kind of look at and be compliant with. And here is probably the origin of non-compliance. Now, in a nutshell, a person in my role is basically a link. And what we do is serve as the go-between between the employer, the product, and regulatory bodies. Now, this is externally. Internally, we are, again, the link between the product developers, the marketing people, sales people, and sometimes even those who talk to consumers, so the consumer affairs people. These are probably the top 6 things I do on a daily basis in my role. And so wanted to share who I work with the most, and also tell you about what happens in this space. So ensuring the company's products comply with the regulations, of course, the whole point of why I am in this company. So a great deal of my work is making sure that I am compliant. And the closest team that I work with on this front is R&D. And the reason I say that is because I have made it a point in my 12 years to try and get into the innovation process as early on as possible. And what that does is it informs R&D what are the requirements for the product from a nutritional standpoint. I think Purnima and Rachna gave a very detailed and a great look at how that actually works in reality in terms of developing claims, being able to make sure that you have the substantiation that you require, and also being able to translate that. And so the next point would be supporting innovation and speed to market from a marketing perspective, making sure that whatever work is being done or claims that you want to do, or say a clinical trial that you might be conducting or helping push through a claim, is translated in a language that marketing can understand. So for marketing, all they want to know or all they need to know is, how is this going to help sell more of my product? Or how will it help people know why they should have my product? And so that's where you translate academic research to marketing messaging. Claims has been one of the biggest, and Rachna rightfully pointed out again in her talk that is a big part of any regulatory function. These days, to differentiate your product on the shelf, these claims are those that actually help you do that. You can do a lot with graphics, you can do a lot with color, you can do a lot with great imaging on your product. But eventually, when people are searching for your product online or trying to look at benefits, one versus the other, there are claims. And inherently, if you see, a lot of consumers mistrust some of these claims because of issues that we have had in the past or lawsuits that have that people have come across. And so I think it is upon us, the nutritionists in the company, the regulatory people, to actually make sure that there is enough transparency, there is enough truthful and not misleading angles to whatever you're trying to put on your product, and making sure that the consumer sees it exactly the way the data is being presented. Apart from this, there are submissions for regulatory approval that I will regularly make. This has been more when I was in India. I've had to make approvals or documentation requests that came up that I would have to submit additional information on in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh was starting up at that point of time. And so a lot of submissions have to be made. It's interesting because that actually gives you a better exposure to regulations on a global scale, because you have to also tell them what's happening in other parts of the world. So another part is advising departments on regulatory requirements. Very often you have to work with supply chain or consumer services. And I'll come to more examples in the coming slides. But supply chain is really important because they are working with suppliers. And so if you are making a claim on your product, you want to make sure that the ingredients that you put into your products are of the same specification constantly, because that's the best way you can make sure that the claim is still tenable. You want to have a product that's consistent and that can support the claim irrespective of whether it was made today or 5 years from now. And so there have been times when I've had to go back and talk to suppliers, ask them additional questions, sometimes talk to their regulatory people, talk to their nutritionists, and come up with documentation that will help us substantiate, or making it clearer actually what my company wants to do with the ingredient, or what's the claim that I plan to make. And just going by Purnima's and Rachna's presentations, it makes me wish I had more nutritionists on the R&D side who could probably understand a lot more of what I have asked of my team here. And so I think there is definitely a space there for nutritionists and people who are trained in our subjects to kind of come up and help industry work out on projects that can touch claims and marketing. And then a big part of my role is also providing strategic advice to management. And this means looking at horizon, regulations on the horizon, what's coming up, what's being proposed. Are there draft regulations that are being planned? Because you have to keep evaluating your entire portfolio with that in mind. So say there's a new limit to one of the ingredients or components or a nutrient that's coming up. You have to now find out which of my products are likely to be affected. Do I need to change? Is there another way I can present that information? Doesn't claim need to change and things like that. This is not just where you are working, but sometimes if you have products that are in other countries, then it's basically a horizon watching each of those countries. Also, global regulations affect the country that you are in. So something that the US does, something that the FSANs in Australia or New Zealand do, affects what other regulatory bodies and agencies are looking at and are trying to accomplish. And so you will find that there is a slow domino effect very often of something that happens somewhere else. So you have to keep in mind and look at regulations even from that perspective. So what I want to share on the next slide is something I did when I joined this role at Bush Brothers. Now, I was coming in from a beverage company to a company that made beans in a can. And if I thought making Coke or a flavored beverage was difficult, I had no idea what I was getting into when I came to beans in a can, because now you have agricultural products that, of course, nature doesn't listen to your specifications. And then you have the processing itself. That's very, very intensive and very different from bottling a beverage. And then, of course, the categories that now I worked in were completely different. So I had to work with FDA and look at regulations in a whole new light. So I try to put a mind map of all the different responsibilities I had, and don't let this overwhelm you. You can see that I've also made a lot of connections between all these different buckets, as I call them, and they all inform each other. So I did have to look at compliance, advocacy, the regulations I had to develop myself. I had to support other functions here. I had to learn about systems and processes because that's where I would get my data, put in my data. I also had to create a regulatory knowledge base with a lot of nutrition and food science, actually for my R&D and marketing people, work on cross-functional teams, make sure that the communication that happens on claims and anything on our product does not make it non-compliant to any of the regulations. And of course, you also have to support operations in terms of issues that come up. For example, I might get a call in the middle of the night saying, we have a whole shift of products on hold because we put on a wrong label. Will this label work for us? Because this is the older version of the label. So looking at that and making sure that it still works, things like that. Now, this is kind of an overview of everything that I do. It's not that I touch all these points every day, but the reason I keep it like this is because I'm very visual. If I didn't see it this way, there are chances that I leave out something for weeks together and not go back to it because somebody didn't ask me a question on that. And so this helps me and kind of keeps me together when I'm on my role. So I have a poster of this in my cabin that helps me stay on track. So this is what I was telling you about. I'd like to talk about the different tasks or parts of my role that I do today and link it back to some of the subjects that either I studied or are part of your curriculum today to just give you an understanding of this is where, if you ever thought when you were doing that course, why am I studying this? This is probably where you would use it if you were in a role similar to mine. Claim substantiation. And I'm not going to belabor this much. Both Rachna and Purnima talked quite a bit on claim substantiation. But because I am between the people who are actually working on the claims and the people who want the claims and talk about the claim, I have to make sure that the work on one hand that's being done is exactly the work that will help me substantiate the claim that marketing intends. And on the other hand, when marketing actually speaks about the claim or puts it in a language that they think resonates with the consumer, I have to make sure that it's actually factual and not misleading and truthful to the work that was conducted or the substantiation that I have. And it's a challenge. There are a lot of claims out there that you will see that you will shake your head at and wonder how they could ever come up with substantiation for that. But believe me, there probably is something out there that can help substantiate most of the claims. But I will also tell you that not every brand manager or not every brand has the same diligence when it comes to substantiation and kind of making a claim. And sometimes it truly is an issue of interpretation. And so there's so much gray in a role like mine and in areas like this in a food industry. For one, that's what gives us job security. It keeps me in my job because they will always need human eyes to basically look at data and help with that translation. Clinical trials and design of experiments, again, talked about quite in detail before, so I won't go too much into it, except to say that I did have the fortune to work with St. John's in Bangalore on a clinical trial, and I didn't realize it at that time, but at the end of the trial, when we were all sitting down and talking about the results and how we will make a claim on our product, it was nice to hear that for the first time they were able to talk in a language with an industry person that made sense to me when I was there at Coke. as much as they could talk to their own colleagues and other people. So I was helping them review their papers that they were kind of wanting to present on this topic and things like that. So it does help. And this is one of the times when I was like, when am I ever going to use statistics in my life? I hope I never have to, but I did. Analytical reports, very important, because you might be the one that's making a call on how will I say what nutrients are in my product or in my ingredients. So the way a lot of companies do is they will analyze the ingredients and have a software roll up the nutritionals through the ingredients to a formula. Or some of them might also analyze a product and then put those nutritional amounts on the label itself. So you have to be able to kind of interpret those reports, make sure that there are enough data points to make that true. And another thing, I'll give you an example of, say there's a limit of 140 milligrams of sodium to make a low sodium claim that I need. You will find that if you do not guide your developers, they're probably developing at 140 milligrams. So you have to go back and say, no, can you go down a little bit? Because the variations in testing methodology, the variations in the way we put it in manufacturing, you don't want to be above the 140. That would make you non-compliant on the label. And so things like that. And marketing, communication, and messaging. This is one of the most challenging aspects of working in regulatory, because you have to be able to translate the work that R&D is working on, the claims that they have been trying to support, sometimes the investments that the company is making in clinical trials in a way that makes sense to consumers. Because what does the industry eventually want? What does your company really need to get out of all of this? They need people to know that their products are good, that this claim is substantiated, they have all the backing that is required, and that there is a a change in either purchase behavior or intent enough to actually give you a return on investment on the claim that you have worked so hard to try and develop. So getting to that communication, helping review that messaging, making sure that it doesn't become misleading, but at the same time conveys enough to the consumer to make sense for them. Very often you also will have to kind of sit down with marketing and help them write what they call romance copy, which is nice, helpful language around their product, and make sure that there are no implied claims there, and say that, no, that looks like it's a claim. So, you know, you cannot say this. And the reason why I said I'd rather not be a policeman and a partner is, instead of telling them, no, you cannot say this, I think the conversation is much easier when it is, what are you trying to say, and can you say it this way? You know, come up with other examples, or try and kind of work around what they cannot say, but not necessarily say, you cannot say this, now come back to me after 3 days with what else you'd like to say. Never works. The different groups that I work with, mostly manufacturing, when I'm talking to my plant, working with people or operators in the plant, I have to work with them on a lot of microbiological issues, because a can sometimes can swell, and then there are issues there. I have to have a good knowledge of microbiology to be able to talk the language that my QA people in the plant talk. Make sure that I know my basics around food preservation, the quality management, food safety, of course. For example, today I am on a committee or a couple of committees with industry bodies here that help talk to government authorities and regulatory agencies on food safety, on intentional adulteration, food defense, or food fraud. And these are all topics that are probably topics for another day, but are topics that have come up in the industry in the past 5-10 years. Also, I do get to work with a lot of dietitians and nutritionists. Today, they are also part of the influencers out in social media. So making sure that we can talk the same language. So marketing usually will talk to a lot of them and then come to me and say, they told us something, but we didn't get it. can you help translate what they're asking or what they're saying, and can they say it this way? And so it's been a very interesting kind of experience going back to dietitians and nutritionists and telling them, yeah, I know a little bit of nutrition, let's discuss. And then they look at you and say, what are you doing on that side of the table then? And so letting them know that there are few, and I think that's been in recent years, few of us who come from a pure food science or a nutrition background in regulatory affairs, because traditionally a lot of people in these roles have come from quality or from R&D, because they worked with regulations at some point of time in their career, couldn't get out of it, and the company said, well, now that you're there, you continue staying there. And so it's been fun talking to them, talking about therapeutic diets, and how there are some claims that we wouldn't like to make, and so explaining why, and also talking to them about recipes. Very often they would like to have a recipe with your product, and so how does that work? You'd be surprised by the interesting conversations I've had even in the past few months. For example, vegetarian. Now, most of us are in a country where we are vegetarian for religious purposes, right? In a lot of other countries, or most other countries, people are vegetarian for lifestyle reasons. And so making sure they understand the difference and what does it actually mean to cater to a vegetarian population subset. Work with chefs, food service, that's a big part of my role today, because food service is an avenue where a lot of our products go, and they have regulations that are just a little different from retail service. And so working with chefs, they often will work with our products, trying to create recipes that either we can use or they can use on in their restaurants, in their food trucks, and sometimes at the stadiums and other venues that they actually serve our food at. And so it's always good to talk to them, understand a little bit of feedback also on how our food should be. Now, this is already at a stage when we have the food ready, the product ready, but we have been getting better and better at getting input from chefs and on the food service side to understand how our products should be made in the first place. So an example would be selling to schools. And the schools here have very specific criteria that a food should kind of match up to before we can offer it for sale in a school setting. And so making sure that our products are talked about in the same language, that they can actually follow those or match those criteria, and making sure that our R&D know things like that up front. So when they're creating the next product, they can create that in mind, so we don't have to come back to it and change anything. And this is what I do probably the most frequently, working with the R&D team, almost like an extension. They like to joke here that they've probably learned more regulatory stuff because I push some of my information up to them. And I feel that helps R&D, because you want them to not come to you as often as they think they need to. You want to give them the guardrails to innovate between, and then come to you for final checks or for novel ingredients or something that's completely new to them. And that helps cut down on speed to market also. So a lot of these subjects that you see that I have put here, by no means are they exhaustive. This is just an indication of, where some of these trainings and some of the topics that you will cover as students will help in a role like mine. So this is all that I had. I didn't have much detail here. I'm open to any of you wanting to contact me. If you can, you could probably scan the QR code on your screens, and if it does, you will have my contact details. Feel free to reach out to me. Happy to answer any questions anytime. And over to you, Anisha. Thank you.